In the annals of history, there are many examples of countries with labyrinthian bureaucratic nightmares for governments. Just ask any American veteran about their experiences at the VA, and then time the length of their rant. The resulting avalanche of profanity should give you a rough idea of how bad it can get. Yet the most famous of all the myriad of disastrous governments across the Gulf of Time was the Byzantine Empire, which had so many overlapping bureaucratic systems that when similarly complex, corrupt, and utterly incomprehensible bureaucracies came along, they were often described as Byzantine bureaucracies. Therefore, it would be quite natural to assume that being the progenitor of the very adjective to describe the world's most complex bureaucratic shitshows, that the Byzantine Empire was indeed the worst offender in the endless struggle between the process of government and actually governing. But, as the old saying goes about assumptions, if you were to actually make that assumption, you would be wrong. Very, very wrong. Hello everyone, welcome back to the horrible history of Russian fighter jets, and by extension, welcome back to the Soviet Union. I know you've missed it. At the end of our previous episode, we entered a fresh and uplifting new chapter of our otherwise long and depressing story. The fascist menace has been thoroughly crushed under the tracks of our T-34s, while our MiG-15s swarm across the azure Korean skies to prepare for the final showdown against the evil forces of capital. With new liberal reforms on the way under everyone's favourite corn enthusiast, Nikita Khrushchev, things finally seem to be looking up. Yet over the horizon, a new threat has started to emerge. The forces of capitalism have not been idle in their means of destroying the workers' revolution. But before we can properly address the threat of Western capital, we will have to know our enemy by becoming our enemy. And with that goal in mind, this video is sponsored by longtime friend of the channel, NordVPN. Look guys, I'm going to keep it simple here. They've been my VPN of choice for over 5 years for very good reason. NordVPN is affordable, efficient, and effective. They have servers all over the world giving you access to region-locked content, which as an anime fan for me is vital. Their website contains every piece of information as well as all the resources required to guard your privacy while browsing. Their plans cover multiple devices with a dedicated app for each device that can share data as well as files using their meshnet system. And of course, it has a full suite of security features including a dark web tracker, comprehensive anti-malware, and browser protection, all of it backed up by 24/7 customer support. Plus, they have a 30-day money-back guarantee if you don't like it, so there's absolutely no risk in you trying them. Just click the link in the description and get 4 months extra on a 2-year plan when you sign up. It'll help the channel, and it will help you have a better experience online. And now, back to the video. Alright. With new, deeper insights into the mind of our implacable foes, we can now clearly see what their ultimate strategy is. That and the fact that the KGB are feeding us intel on their ever-expanding nuclear arsenal, while we can literally see their aircraft flying along our borders at insane altitudes. The arrival of the absolutely stunningly gorgeous B-47 Stratojet caused great consternation and a rising sense of unease amidst the senior Soviet leadership. It was apparent that the Americans had the capability, and the willingness, to launch a full-scale nuclear-first strike with high-altitude, high-speed jet bombers launched from the continental United States. Prior to this, both sides had been using the Boeing B-29, in Soviet service the Tu-4, to carry their nuclear deterrent, which, when you consider the advent of the jet fighter, rendered the threat of a nuclear war to be an abstract hypothetical scenario relegated to a potential showdown in Western Europe, with tactical weapons mounted on conventional aircraft and goofy little things like the Davy Crockett. Neither side was really capable of obliterating the other in full, until now. Clearly, something had to be done to counter this threat as soon as possible, and to that end, orders went out to the large aircraft designer Tupolev to refine the Soviet copy of the B-29 into an indigenous long-range bomber capable of hitting the US mainland, while a new design bureau under one of Tupolev's students, one Vladimir Misacheyev, was set up to build an intercontinental jet bomber capable of delivering a larger nuclear payload than the B-47 could carry right to the middle of the Pentagon. However, this didn't solve the main issue, that being stopping the capitalists from atomizing Moscow. For that, they would need a dedicated interceptor aircraft capable of taking down the new bombers, Which is where the title and the opening monologue to this video come in. Because what resulted from this effort was such a colossal bureaucratic clusterfuck that it resulted in the biggest, the fastest, and the ugliest fighter aircraft collectively to ever get built. But, like always, to truly understand the ridiculous sequence of events that occurred, we are going to need some historical context, and for that, we once again need to go back to before World War II. Because unlike all the other fighters we've discussed thus far, the Interceptors are an entirely separate beast with an entirely separate storyline. Because unlike the other countries, which quite sensibly have only one air force, maybe two at the most, the Soviet Union had four. And I need to explain why. After the formation of the Soviet Union as a fully integrated nation in early 1923, the Red Peasants' air fleet that fought for the Bolsheviks through the Russian Civil War was reorganized into the Red Army Air Force, or the VVS for short. Squadrons and regiments were assembled in accordance with the ubiquitous Soviet military district system. You had Kiev Military District, Leningrad Military District, Moscow Military District, etc., etc. However, this would later change when the technologies and doctrines of aerial warfare became more advanced, and by extension, more specialized. Thus, very soon, you had frontal aviation, army aviation, force aviation, and long-range aviation, each assigned to air armies that were in turn allocated to a military district or army group, an army group known as a front in the Soviet parlance, such as Stalingrad Front, Ukrainian Front, Belarusian Front, you get the idea. Then, of course, you have naval aviation, which again, because the Soviet Union didn't have any aircraft carriers yet, was its own unique branch of ground-based aircraft similar to Coastal Command in the Royal Air Force. Yet, thanks to Soviet bureaucracy and its tendency to have a million different competing agencies, it operated under the naval chain of command, so there was an entirely separate naval air force operating out of Murmansk, Crimea, and Kronstadt respectively. Now, all of this is complicated enough. God knows, as someone who spends all his time reading about the Soviet system, not even really I understand it. And yet there is still one more layer to this complicated communist cake. The Soviet Union, despite its intention to spread the world proletarian revolution, was, as we've established, utterly paranoid about defending its sovereignty at all costs. As such, the Politburo and Council of Ministers gave explicit orders for each of the military districts to allocate dedicated fighter squadrons for air defense over major Soviet cities, meaning you now had random fighter squadrons, all technically under the command of one of these various branches, assigned to a completely different mission from the rest of the other squadrons. Worse still, they would, by the nature of their mission, have to have their own chain of command that also controlled the various other air defense assets in the area, such as AA guns and barrage balloons, both of which also had separate units that tended to get assigned to different branches based on operational necessity. Basically, what I'm trying to demonstrate is that the Soviet air forces during World War II were a complete organizational and bureaucratic nightmare, a state of affairs that became blatantly obvious as the monobollocked morons and his brown-shirted buffoons started rolling their panzers over the Soviet-German border on June 22nd, 1941, kicking off everyone's favourite story, Hitler and Halder's most excellent Eastern adventure. And as Luftwaffe bombers started making their presence felt in Moscow's skies, a long overdue decision was made to centralize all dedicated air defense assets into a single chain of command, whose sole responsibility was the protection of the motherland and its airspace against all potential threats. They would be an entirely new branch of service inside the Soviet armed forces that would stand alone in achieving this most vital task. And thus, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, or the PVO, was born. Their beginning was a humble one, and their stable of aircraft reflected it. The MiG-3, while excellent at high altitude, was in all other instances rather substandard, hence why it got relegated to air defense duties. And as for the rest, they were all hand-me-downs from the frontline VVS, which had since been rendered obsolete, such as the Yak-1 and the Lag-3. Yet that didn't accurately reflect the quality of their pilots. Throughout the course of the war, a number of famous Soviet aces would find their start in the PVO, the most famous of which being from the 586th PVO Fighter Regiment. One, Lydia Litviak, the first woman to score a kill in air-to-air combat, not to mention the first female fighter ace, a distinction she shares with her best friend and wingwoman Katya Budanova, who also began her career in the same squadron. And once the Soviet aviation industry caught up with demand after its evacuation to the Ural Mountains, the PVO would be equipped with the most modern fighters available, including every Lend-Lease fighter type as well as the Yak-9, Yak-3, LA-5, and LA-7. And unlike all the other combat aviation units, due to their specialist role, they would all be equipped with the top-of-the-line gear. They would have radios, navigation systems, the works. With these new machines and excellent pilots, the PVO would be the only branch of the Soviet armed forces to achieve a positive kill-to-death ratio against the fascist invaders, averaging 2.5 kills for every 1 loss in aerial combat. And after the Red Banner was raised triumphantly over the Reichstag, in recognition of the vital role they would play in the upcoming Cold War, when the Red Army was comprehensively reformed to resolve all the inefficiencies and aforementioned bureaucratic nightmares discovered during the relentless onslaught of the Eastern Front, the PVO was granted seniority over the Soviet Air Force. Only the Red Army and the strategic rocket forces in charge of the nukes outranked them. They were the cornerstone of the Soviet Union's defense, and so when they put in a request for new equipment, the Council of Ministers listened. Especially when the request is worded, "We can't stop you getting melted by the Sun 2 electric boogaloo unless we get a new plane." I'm paraphrasing, but you get the gist. Now, the situation wasn't completely catastrophic. The MiG-15 BIS could, and in fact did, intercept the B-47 quite reliably. So much so that the PVO was fully equipped with MiG-15s within the first 2 years of it entering production. However, there was one teeny tiny, ever so slight issue with the MiG-15 that proved rather awkward. You see, while the badass bundle of sticks was overflowing with pride in the Soviet Union, and perfectly capable of shooting down these filthy capitalist pigs in their fancy Stratojets, it couldn't do it if it rained, or snowed, or if the enemy showed up between 7 PM and 6 AM. The problem with daytime air superiority fighters of the early Cold War is that while they were designed to be the pinnacle in performance, that didn't leave a lot of room for complex navigation systems or an air intercept radar, which, due to being in the early stages of their development, were large, complex, and as a result, heavy. And in the technically disadvantaged Soviet Union, this was doubly the case. The Anglo-American alliance had a huge lead in radar and computer technology, a lead they would retain for the entire duration of history's largest game of chicken, much to the chagrin of the Soviet intelligentsia, who, despite their manufacturing disadvantage, would produce some of the finest computer scientists in the world. Case in point, everyone in the world has played Tetris. Seriously though, some of the mainframes built by the Soviets in the 70s and 80s were genuine works of art. I should do an entire video on Soviet computers at some stage, because they are endlessly fascinating. In fact, my dear friend and collaborator on this video behind the scenes, Combination K, has an upcoming series on the Red Army integrating computer command systems into their chain of command, which, when she makes it, will be utterly fantastic, so make sure to check her out in the description below. Anyway, the Soviet high-technology sector was lagging behind by a year or two in radar development, and the first-generation sets were either effective or small. They couldn't be both. The Tauri-class radar, or thorium radar, with the later revised models being known colloquially as the Caution, was the first generation of Soviet air intercept radars that comfortably fit into a fighter aircraft designed in the USSR. And it was built by this absolute unit of a man, Comrade Andrei Borisovich Slepushkin. You just know homie is in good with the Politburo with that many chins. However, the Caution's maximum detection range was between 15 to 20 kilometers, or roughly 10 miles, and that was in perfect conditions. In suboptimal conditions, it could go down to as low as 3 to 5 miles, and the early models were worse than that, which quite frankly was unacceptable. Yet a bad radar is better than no radar, and when combined with a ground-controlled intercept system not limited by weight or size restrictions, a Soviet fighter could be manually steered onto the target to get inside the onboard radar's effective range. So the PVO's review board deemed it satisfactory for the moment. What mattered was getting an all-weather interceptor into production as quickly as possible. However, that led to the next problem. The added weight of the radar and specialist navigation equipment required for an all-weather interceptor would compromise the range and performance of the Soviets' current range of aircraft. Artyom Mikoyan, in the effort to keep his streak of getting a prototype out as fast as humanly possible to capitalize on demand, had already fitted a Caution to a MiG-15, giving it this cute, adorable little nose. But, to compensate for the extreme increase of weight, they had to remove half the guns and their ammunition, while the extra workload for the pilot to operate the radar, given they were flying the aircraft in poor weather or under IFR conditions, was extremely inefficient at best and potentially dangerous at worst. Yet there was also one other critical issue with using converted day fighters. In fact, it was a big issue. Literally. The Soviet Union is big. Like, really big. Like, the biggest country to ever exist big. Successfully guarding its aerial borders would be an immense challenge. It took an aircraft the size of a bomber just to get a third of the way across the place. With that information in mind, Soviet Air Force planners ran the numbers and projected the size of an aircraft to accomplish this mission to 100% efficiency would be massive, far beyond the capability of anything they could build at the time. Thus, MiG-15s and later the MiG-17 were really only useful as point defense interceptors, not for patrolling. They just didn't have the range or the payload to do that mission effectively. And while they obviously could scramble to intercept incoming targets, with the speed of the Stratojet and the altitude it flew at, by the time they got up to altitude and engaged them, there was a good chance the enemy would already be over their target, dropping their nukes. No. They were going to need a larger and more powerful aircraft with loiter capability, lots of firepower, and a two-man crew, with a dedicated radar intercept officer to make this work. An aircraft that could get airborne fast, navigate and engage independently, and hang around at altitude waiting for an intercept vector before the Americans arrived. But an aircraft with an extra man, bigger weapons, a large clunky radar, and enough fuel to loiter for tasking would, by necessity, have to confront the inevitability of the laws of physics, and, by extension, the theory of gravity. More weight means plane heavy. Plane heavy means slow speed and slow ceiling height. Therefore, plane not interceptor unless it have more power. It was clear that once again they needed a stronger engine. Thankfully though, the Mikoyan Bureau was hard at work designing one, designated the AM-5. Let's check in on their progress. Well, that's unfortunate. And Lyulka's new A7F turbojets are still in the early stages of development. That leaves the only option. The venerable, ever-reliable Rolls-Royce Neen powering the MiG-15. However, given its centrifugal design, the aerodynamic drag caused by putting it into an underwing pod would be immense. Something completely unsuitable for an interceptor. Something the Sukhoi Design Bureau had found out already to their chagrin, for they had already tried fitting centrifugal Rolls-Royce Derwent engines to their version of the Me-262, the Su-13. So, when the Council of Ministers issued a directive to Sukhoi for the design of a high-speed, swept-wing interceptor, capable of fitting an air intercept radar and remaining airborne for extended periods of time, while simultaneously utilising the existing version of the Neen engine, it left Pavel and the gang in a serious engineering quandary. How are they going to make use of a second-generation centrifugal jet to power an aircraft of the required size without using two of them in underwing pods? It was then that the design team had a stroke of genius. Technically speaking, if you have a nose-mounted intake feeding a fuselage-mounted jet engine, you only have a single axis of thrust. So what if you could mount two engines along that single axis? That would grant you double the power, while retaining the streamlined aerodynamic shape of a single-engine fighter. Indeed, Artyom Mikoyan had already proved that fact with the MiG-9. Except here, the same problem with the centrifugal jets appears once again. It's just too wide. To mount them side by side, or even vertically, would be completely impractical. Yet what if you were to use the same intake to power both engines, and then stagger them? We already know all the aerodynamic characteristics of a tadpole fuselage using a Rolls-Royce Derwent. Yakovlev did that with his Yak-23, and we have all that data through saga. Suppose we just add another engine. So they did. Ladies, gentlemen, bitches, bros, and non-binary hoes, I welcome you all to the era of the tadpole twinjet. Behold! The Su-15 1.0. Look at that smile, he's just a happy little guy. Yes, you aren't hallucinating. What that is a single-seat, jet-powered interceptor, which, due to the lack of a high-powered axial flow afterburning turbojet being available, is powered by two Klimov RD-45 centrifugal jets, or, in other words, two Rolls-Royce Neons. One mounted in the fuselage as per the industry standard, and another one mounted in a tadpole configuration at the front, complete with a Tori A radar and twin 37mm cannons. This thing is a majestic example of Soviet engineering weirdness when confronted with a seemingly insurmountable challenge. Aside from the bizarre engine layout, to ensure enough air gets fed to the rear-mounted engine, the cockpit is fitted left of center and above the front-mounted engine, so they could run the intake ducts directly. This of course means the lead computing gun sight mounted for the cannons had to be completely reconfigured to match the pilot's unusual head position, while the intake is absolutely massive, with a really odd vertical divider that splits the airflow vertically instead of the conventional twin S ducts around the cockpit. A cockpit that was fully pressurized, a rarity in Soviet designs of the period. However, despite its strangeness, it was no slouch by any means, reaching a speed of 650 miles an hour at sea level and possessing an utterly ridiculous climb rate of 6,000 feet per minute. The only problem was that when our favourite test pilot Anaconda from Part 2 decided to try and push the aircraft beyond those limitations on its 39th test flight, the Su-15 developed a serious transonic flutter that reverberated throughout the entire airframe into the rudder pedals. The reverberation then quickly became an uncommanded oscillation, which started to tear the aircraft apart, forcing our friend Sergei to use its revolutionary new high-speed ejector seat in order to avoid joining the Sukhoi and spreading itself across the greater Moscow area. Work on a second prototype began immediately after the demise of the first, with a complete slew of improvements being added, including Fowler design flaps and a pioneering combination engine cooling and fire suppression system. But sadly, the Politburo ordered the project cancelled. A decision that eventually, after another aborted adventure into the world of fighter design we shall talk about in the main series, led to the Sukhoi Bureau being closed down entirely. Yet don't worry, comrades. As we know, Pavel and the gang shall return in style. With Sukhoi retired from the Interceptor program, the task fell to the other two design bureaus specializing in fighters currently in Stalin's good books, Mikoyan I-320 and OKB Lavochkin. Artyom Mikoyan, as mentioned before, had hedged his bets by installing radars in various models of MiG-15 and later 17. However, the limitations of that airframe have already been covered and hadn't been resolved. The MiG-17, though, did see a breakthrough in terms of the type of radar used. While Comrade Lavochkin had been working on the Tori-type radar, its limitations were starting to become apparent, hence why he was working on the Caution upgrade. The reason was it was a single antenna system without any of the fancy technical refinements we have in modern radars. The Caution was very hands-on and required constant attention by the pilot to acquire and hold a target track, resulting in an awfully high workload for the pilot. A solution to this problem, though, had been achieved by the other main radar designer in the Soviet Union, one Viktor Tikhomirov, and his Izumrud, or Emerald RP-1 system. This system was groundbreaking in its design on every level. It was heavier and bulkier than the Caution by a significant degree, due to the fact that it used two radar antennas, one for area search and the other for target tracking. On the MiG-17PF, you can see the little lip arcing over the intake containing one antenna, while the other is placed in the middle of the intake along the longitudinal axis of the aircraft, right on the splitter, right there. Its range and reliability was similar to the Caution, as in, not very impressive at all. Until you realize that because of this dual antenna design, it was one of, if not the very first air intercept radar capable of track while scan. Granted, it could only track one target, but for 1950, that is an incredible leap forwards. And as such, the Emerald RP-1, later improved to the RP-5, would become the primary air intercept radar for the first generation of PVO jet fighters. The downside to it, though, was its weight and aerodynamic impact were considerable, which led the Mikoyan design team initially to adopt the Caution, with a dedicated radar intercept officer to make up for the workload. Then, after taking their very successful MiG-15 design and adapting it for a two-seat tandem twin-engine configuration, just as Sukhoi had done, the MiG factory produced this, the I-320 Interceptor. And it is absolutely fucking hideous. Just look at this abomination. Ugh. I mean, you've just taken the gorgeous MiG-15, MiG-17 design and completely ruined it. It is an affront to my eyes and to any aviation lover across the world. But as we know, the Soviets have never really worried about the aesthetics of their weapon systems, as is blatantly obvious to anyone with a pair of eyes. What mattered was the performance, which was actually quite impressive. 660 miles an hour in level flight. The climb rate wasn't as good as the Sukhoi design, but that was to be expected due to the extra crew member. However, the old demons that plagued the MiG-15, instability at high speeds, lack of control authority, and the dreaded wing drop, returned with a nasty vengeance. Worse still, the lack of rigidity in the wing contributed to these issues by threatening to snap the airfoil entirely should aggressive maneuvers become necessary. Thus, the first prototype was quickly retired, and a second one with multiple improvements, as well as two brand new Klimov VK-1s, was produced to continue testing. This new model got all the way up to 677 miles an hour. With the issues being ironed out and a high level of performance, it appeared that MiG had once again struck gold. Except the wings still didn't work properly, and before they could fix them, a faulty installation job on the aircraft's twin 23mm cannons caused a shell to detonate in the chamber that subsequently blew the nose off the aircraft. Ah, Soviet quality control, isn't it wonderful? Therefore, a third prototype was produced, with further refinements, including guns that worked and an additional wing fence to improve high-speed performance. But once again, the loss of prototypes and delays in production had soured confidence in the project, while putting them behind the technological curve. And so MiG was sent back to focus on the next generation of air superiority fighter, something we will talk about later. This left the Lavochkin Bureau. And if you thought what the other teams came up with were ridiculous, oh boy. The team at Lavochkin, after losing their struggle with MiG for the primary frontline fighter due to their aircraft's unit cost, even though theirs had superior air combat performance and looks way cooler in my opinion, but whatever, they decided that instead of making a cheaper, more practical design to undercut MiG and win the Interceptor contract outright, they decided to not only double, but triple the fuck down. They resolved to build the most advanced interceptor aircraft in the world, and certainly the best aircraft the Soviet Union could produce, and to hell with the consequences. They were going to win this contract and push the Soviet Union to the forefront of combat aviation, even if it killed them. And it probably would. The tadpole configuration for the twin engines, used by the other design bureaus, was definitely more efficient than the underwing pods, but it was still an aerodynamic compromise that caused a significant amount of drag. Furthermore, the conventional mounting of the landing gear in the wings generates even more drag, while reducing the efficiency of a high-speed swept aerofoil designed for transonic and later supersonic flight. Thus, Lavochkin decided that instead of the proven tadpole design, they were going to use a trick pioneered by Dornier during the dying days of the Great Patriotic War. Oh yeah, boys, you better believe it. After designing a streamlined, wide-body cigar-shaped fuselage, as was common for jets at the time, with exceptional aerodynamic properties, they mounted one uprated VK-1 Neen in the rear of the aircraft, as per standard practice, and then mounted the other right in front of the pilot at a 45-degree angle while running the jet pipe between the legs of the pilot and Rio through an exhaust fairing in the center of the fuselage, feeding both engines using the same frontal intake, with the radar dome doubling as a diffusing inlet cone. A very forward-thinking piece of aviation design. This was really ahead of its time. With that done, they then went ahead and piled every piece of advanced pioneering technology currently available in the Soviet aviation industry into the remaining space in the airframe. In 1949, this aircraft had a fully functioning two-way IFF system, a radar altimeter, an automatic radio compass, a pressurized cockpit, a fully hydraulically actuated control system for every single flight surface, complex landing gear that retracted rearwards into the fuselage in a unique folding system similar to the one adopted on the MiG-23 20 years later, an automated de-icing system that used bleed air from the engine to prevent ice formation on the leading edge of the wing, and to top it all off, a fully functional instrument landing system for zero visibility landings that could be assisted by a GCI station. Lavochkin was leaving nothing to chance. He was going to win this thing. So even though Mikoyan was already running flight tests across both the MiG-15P and the I-320, the Lavochkin team was comprehensively testing every single system under simulated operational conditions on the ground. This was revolutionary technique, pioneering stuff. Practically every flaw that could be discovered in ground testing was found and rectified with supreme alacrity. A process far more efficient than having to rework a flying prototype repeatedly on the go. Something MiG found out when that cannon shell demolished his I-320. But you can't figure out everything on the ground, and so, on September 16th, 1949, the LA-200, as it was designated, took its first flight. And when it did, the performance of the prototype was phenomenal. It had a top speed in excess of 670 miles an hour, with a combat load, and a ludicrous climb rate of around 7,000 feet per minute. However, at those high speeds, the hydraulic actuators weren't calibrated correctly, and as a result, the pilot needed to be an Olympic bodybuilder to move the joystick. Which was a problem, because the same wing drop issue that kept happening on the MiG-15 had made another appearance on the LA-200, which, should they fail to slow down, would have the same fatal consequences, forcing a comprehensive rework of the aerodynamics and multiple tweaks to the hydraulic system. Thankfully, though, MiG's work on the 15 had already given them the solution to both problems, and so, less than 3 months later, a new and improved prototype rolled out of the factory and began testing. These results, too, were spectacular. Fitted with an operational loadout, the speed had dropped slightly, but not to a degree that threatened the overall performance of the aircraft. And so, with supreme confidence in their design, the Lavochkin engineering team submitted it to the PVO for testing, who immediately told them to go fuck themselves. You see, like MiG, they had decided to use the Tauri A radar with the single emitter, because they had a dedicated RIO to operate it, so why would we need the more complex, heavier system? But even taking that into account, the PVO weren't really happy with the radar's performance, given that they had struggled to maintain lock on a B-29 at 5 miles. Which, you have to say, when you consider the size of a B-29, is utterly pathetic. This didn't matter though, as so confident was he that his aircraft was a good quality product, Lavochkin cashed in a few political favours, including his favours with Politburo member and Armaments Minister Nikolai Bulganin, who subsequently pulled some strings to get the LA-200 accepted for trials. When the PVO got it though, they decided to really push the airframe well beyond its limits, putting it in situations that could happen in combat. And as a result, the LA-200 started having major issues. It turned out that they actually hadn't fixed the wing drop problem. It had just shifted to the other wing when nearing top speed, an issue which nearly killed the test pilot during testing. There was also the slight issue that the radio aerial hadn't been placed intelligently, and during long flights the jet blast from the forward engine would literally melt the antenna. Also, half the advanced systems on the aircraft mentioned at the start were still in their early stages of development and needed continuous tweaking and often just didn't work. The worst issue, though, was a massive amount of vibration in the aft engine compartment. You see, one of the major benefits of having a twin-engined combat aircraft is power plant redundancy. If shit goes south and an engine fails, or more likely gets shot out to hell, the ability to limp back home on the other engine is a very desirable design feature, especially in a big country like Russia, the Soviet Union, or indeed Australia, which is why we bought the F-18 in the 80s. However, a prerequisite to this is you have to make sure that your aircraft can actually fly on one engine. So, during one of the tests, the PVO test pilot shut down the rear engine to see just how it would affect performance, only to encounter a vibration so violent it nearly tore the entire tail assembly off. Extremely pissed off at having to deal with an aircraft they really didn't want, but the Politburo forced on them, and then having to deal with all this bullshit, the VVS and PVO test pilots unionized and sent the LA-200 back to Lavochkin to work out what was wrong. So, when they got it back, the Lavochkin engineers took it apart, ran their usual tests, and then launched an extensive flight test program to try and diagnose the issue. And the resulting data from these tests showed something utterly ridiculous. The aerodynamics of the LA-200 are designed to run on the idea that a single intake is feeding two engines while going at high transonic speed. With the rear engine reduced to idle, the airflow through the intake is reduced while the overall airspeed drops. When this happens, the boundary layer of air slipping over the forward half of the fuselage gets thicker, while simultaneously getting disrupted, causing a serious vibration. However, you've all been waiting patiently. You've been sitting here all episode. You've been a fantastic audience. You've been really good. And so to reward you all for your attention and your effort, it's time for the line, viewers. Are you ready? You've been waiting for it. Everybody, you at the back, I can see you. Are you ready? Say the line with me now. And then it got worse. It turned out that when idling or disengaging the rear engine, the disrupted airflow and residual exhaust gases from the front engine weren't getting pushed out of the rear jet pipe, meaning you have all this air pressure building up in the rear fuselage, threatening to shake it apart if not completely blowing the tail off. This was, to put it mildly, suboptimal. Thus, a solution had to be found. Which means, ladies, gentlemen, bitches, bros, and non-binary hoes, once again, we've been waiting all video for it. It is time for some smacalka. After analysing the airflow and aerodynamic data, the engineers consulted with their colleagues in the VVS PVO flight test program and drew the same conclusion. They had a solution. And that solution was, send Yuri and Volodya out to the LA-200 and cut 2 holes in the rear fuselage. Yes. They sent the ground crew out to the prototype and pulled off the maintenance hatches for the rear engine. See, comrades, there is no air hole in back of aircraft. Air no get stuck, plane no explode. Is good. And this actually fucking worked. So they replaced the hatches and cut 2 holes in the fuselage as dedicated pressure vents. The vibrations are gone. Huzzah! Now all they need to do is fix the wing drop problem, which they fixed the exact way they fixed it on the MiG-15. Chuck in another hydraulic actuator on the aileron, strengthen the wing, make sure the flaps don't accidentally and spontaneously open at random intervals, which had been happening with alarming frequency, and then bolt a bendable strip of aluminium to the back of the wing so the ground crew can hammer out any asymmetric airflow. Oh, and they also installed a cooling vent for the radio antenna so the front engine didn't melt it anymore. Happy days. All good. And so, with all these modifications made, as well as a few minor adjustments to the landing gear, everything seemed to be on track for a successful conversion into operational service. And then, it got worse. As we know, before certifying an aircraft for combat, you have to push it through a full course of extreme maneuvers through adverse conditions, which is what kicked off the debacle with the engines. The turn rate, climb rate, and overall speed were excellent, rivaling even the single-seat fighters of the time. So they tried putting it through maneuvers that it would most likely encounter in a dogfight should it ever be unlucky enough to get into one. And then all hell broke loose. It turned out that while they had fitted a comprehensive hydraulic control system, the system itself was designed around high-speed flight, and only high-speed flight. No one had considered the fact that should there be a dogfight or an in-flight emergency, that the hydraulic system would need to be over-pressurized to account for extreme angles of attack, or in this case, negative G. If the LA-200 was forced into a negative G maneuver for longer than 10 seconds, the entire hydraulic system would fail completely. Meaning, in this extreme circumstance, which would most likely be an emergency, the pilot and Rio would have to grab the controls and heave with all their strength just to bring the aircraft under control. And when they attempted to do just that during the testing, the LA-200 snapped into a brutal tailspin to the left, sending them spiraling out of control, which, during that test flight, pushed the LA to nearly the speed of sound in an uncontrolled spinning dive where they exceeded 5 sustained Gs, and they weren't wearing G-suits. It is a testament to the skill and sheer grit of Soviet test pilots that they managed to not only survive, but safely recover the aircraft after pulling out of this spin, at less than 2,000 feet above the ground, though they definitely needed new underwear and new flight suits afterwards. Combine this serious design flaw with a radar that, despite the best efforts of Soviet technicians, didn't fucking work, and combine it then with drop tanks trying to tear the wings off at speeds over Mach 0.8, and cannons that jammed when trying to fire while in a turn, at any speed, at any G loading, it was starting to look pretty dire for the LA-200. Except, the raw performance in speed and overall handling were deemed satisfactory. As such, the PVO told Lavochkin to go back and fix the issues, install the new model of Caution or Emerald radar, and we should be Gucci. Except, it was now September 1950, and the Lavochkin team had been assigned to work on a new project, with the codename Bureaucratic, a project expected to revolutionize the entire field of air defense. The advances in radar technology in the span of 10 years was simply staggering, and it was continuing to develop at an exponential rate. The development of the Emerald air intercept radar was revolutionary to be sure, but the weight and size of radar systems were, as we've established, a serious problem for the interceptor program. However, land-based weapons would not suffer from the same restrictions. As long as it fits on the back of a truck, it wouldn't matter how big or heavy it is. Furthermore, the Soviets had been working on a way to integrate their interceptors with a ground-based controlled intercept system that could automate the interception and engagement process entirely. Their focus on centrally commanding every aspect of combat operations extended to every single branch and every theatre of war: land, sea, and air. And their developments in this regard led to a simple conclusion. If we have simple radars able to be fitted to the nose of a fighter, and ground intercept systems capable of detecting, tracking, and autonomously guiding a fighter to the target, why not simply use it to guide a weapon? During World War II, it became standard practice across all the major powers to augment their anti-aircraft guns with radar tracking and computer-calculated firing solutions. Theoretically, with the advent of UHF radars and remote control technology, it should be possible to track a target, fire a weapon, and then provide that weapon with up-to-date targeting information, allowing it to make an intercept. Namely, a surface-to-air missile. Lavochkin, alongside his deputy, Pyotr Dmitrievich Grushin, began developing the first generation of Soviet SAMs on the direct orders of Comrade Stalin himself, with the express purpose of defending Moscow from any potential threats. And like with the jet program, they had the advantage of German technology, giving them a head start. In the dying days of World War II, Werner von Braun and his team at Peenemünde had been working on a variant of the V-2 rocket able to be guided by the existing German radar network in conjunction with a weapons systems operator on the ground. The idea being that the SAM operator manually guides the missile into the target using radar steering instructions relayed to him on a CRT monitor, in a similar system to the one used on the Fritz X-bomb and the Henschel anti-ship missile. This missile system was codenamed Wasserfall, or Waterfall, and while never successfully deployed, had made serious progress in the pioneering of SAM development. And all their research data, as well as an example of the missile itself, had fallen into Soviet hands, which, when combined with the aforementioned technological advances in radar and computing, represented by the cutting-edge B-200 fire control radar, the team at Lavochkin were able to refine the design into a functional and actually quite terrifying weapons system: the S-25 or SA-1 Guild. It's this early adoption and successful implementation of the SAM concept that allowed the Soviets to lead the West in SAM technology until their collapse in the early 90s and the advent of the Patriot PAC-1. So, with Lavochkin working on SAMs and the entire Soviet military starting to shift over to a missile-based air defense system, as well as developing the first generation of radar-guided air-to-air missiles, under the design leadership of our favourite rocket plane-wielding madman Matus Biznovat, the Interceptor program was put on notice. The original Interceptor concept that the LA-200 had been designed to meet was no longer required, and thus, despite being issued the LA-17 designation and approved for adoption by the PVO, the Council of Ministers closed the project, and that appeared to be that. Except it wasn't. Because out of nowhere, a new challenger emerged that changed the game. After being relegated to the bureaucratic hellscape after failing to secure any military contracts, the OG aviation minister and savior of the Soviet fighter force returned for his last hurrah. Coming in out of left field, off the top rope, it's our boy, Alexander Yakovlev. Throughout the period of history we've been discussing thus far, Yakovlev had actually been competing for every single contract that came up. As Mig and Lavochkin were duking it out over which fighter designated 15 would be superior, Yakovlev put out no less than 3 different fighter prototypes as well as a candidate for an all-weather single-engine interceptor, and all of them failed to make it through to adoption. With this generational run of failures, after seemingly being the golden boy of Soviet fighter aviation who saved the nation, Yakovlev decided fuck it and attempted to fulfill Stalin's order for the design and construction of a heavy-lift helicopter. The Yak-24, as it came to be known, was powered by two ASH-82 radial motors, the same engine from an LA-5, linked together to simultaneously power both rotors. This saved on development and construction time, which was crucial given that Stalin only allowed them a year to build it. However, the consequences of that decision resulted in a helicopter that nearly shook itself apart and had massive reliability problems. It set a few records, sure, especially for heavy lift capacity, but after a few years only around 50 to 60 were built, at which point they were immediately replaced by Mills' Mi-6. And speaking of which, Mill and Kamov, after witnessing this debacle take place, just looked over at old mate Alexander and simply said, no. Just no. Bro, don't worry about it, we got this. Mill, Kamov, we've got this whole thing on lock. This whole chopper thing, it ain't for you, Chief. I mean, you were so great at paperwork. The Air Ministry ran great with you at the helm. It was so efficient. And the headers were actually really good on the documents. Like, maybe actually graphic design is your true passion. Just go over there and leave this whole helicopter thing to us, okay? It appeared that the famous and storied legacy of OKB Yakovlev was going to be consigned to the dustbin of history. Yet it was then fate cast him a lifeline. The boffins over at the research OKB developing radar technology, under Comrade Tikhomorov, had, in the time between the Emerald being rolled out and the Interceptor contract being assigned, developed a brand new air intercept radar that was far more effective than previous sets. The only downside, as you can probably guess given the established limitations of Soviet radar technology, was its chonkiness. The Sukhoi, or Falcon, air intercept radar was a hefty boy. Much like Comrade Lavochkin, I am in awe of its size. It was indeed an absolute unit. An absolute sensor unit, if you will. It had far superior range to the other air intercept radars, and better still, with the correct gun sight, it could automatically range and adjust a firing solution for the pilot similar to the F-86 Sabre, combining both a search and a targeting radar. However, as with every new form of new technology, it still needed some quality control testing, which gave Yakovlev an opening to come forward to the Politburo and say, hey, I'm not doing anything like those other bureaus. I could design a purpose-built aircraft to fit this radar and power it with the new Mikoyan AM-5s. By the time the engines have stopped exploding and the radar has its kinks ironed out, I'll have a purpose-built platform ready to go. Not only that, I'll even design the airframe to be fully multi-role capable so we can sub out the radar for cameras or bombs or anything else. I'll build a one-stop shop for everything and I'll do it cheaper than Artyom can. Inspired by his confidence, or maybe he pulled in a few favors, the Council of Ministers, approved by the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, sent out Directive 29291379, ordering Yakovlev to design and field a two-seat all-weather patrol interceptor that could mount the new radar and be powered by Mikoyan AM-5 jets, while having a long range, extended loiter time, and the ability to convert the airframe into a high-altitude reconnaissance or tactical bomber variant. Alexander knew that this was his chance to get back in the game, and what's more, he knew exactly what to do. He had decided from the outset that he was going to stay with convention and use all the lessons from his string of failures to create something affordable, practical, and effective. His all-weather interceptor design, the Yak-50, was a great design. In fact, it was capable of going supersonic in a shallow dive. Its main failings were a lack of horizontal stability, making aiming the guns difficult, a single engine which limited the range of the aircraft, and the lack of a second crew member to act as a weapon systems operator for the more complex manual radars of the period. Other than that, the aerodynamics were solid, the technology on board was state-of-the-art, the ergonomics for the pilot were excellent, and its overall flight characteristics were superior to all of its competitors. This led Yakovlev to a simple decision: adapt the design to meet the new requirements. The stability, range, and crew issues we can solve very simply. Make the airframe larger, which, by extension, means enlarging the primary flight and control surfaces. Then we compensate for this increase in size and weight by fitting two much more powerful axial flow AM-5 turbojets under the wings. Wings that will be swept at a steeper angle to improve high-speed performance. This also negates the need for a nose-mounted air intake, leaving us all the room in the world for that big-ass radar. Chuck the guns in blisters along the fuselage, use a bicycle undercarriage to maximise the fuel capacity while keeping the aircraft streamlined, add a back seat, and hey presto, we have an interceptor, recon aircraft, ejector seat equipment tester, and tactical bomber, all under budget in record time. The Yak-120 prototype, soon to be known as the Yak-25, was a truly excellent piece of aircraft design. It may look ungainly, but looks are deceiving. It was agile, efficient, and fast, while being fully decked out with the same level of tech as the LA-200, if not better. Yakovlev had, in record time, designed something truly spectacular. There was just one small problem. Well, not exactly small, and that was the problem. That big Sukhoi radar the entire aircraft was designed around wasn't ready yet. Nor was half the other equipment. Or the engines, actually. And given that this was the entire point of the aircraft existing, they couldn't exactly proceed with the state acceptance trials that the Yak would have to go through. And as we've established, those trials are long. So there would be a considerable delay between the construction of the aircraft and the actual adoption process, which gave the team at Lavochkin the chance for the comeback of the century. As stated before, the LA-200 had already been accepted for production, and given the PVO desperately needed an interceptor to meet the threat of the B-47 swarm, despite them initially being opposed to the aircraft at first, they now begged the Politburo to provide them with the LA-200 in the interim until the Yak-25 was ready. However, this led to the very obvious question being asked back at them. We did all of this to use a new, more capable radar that actually works. Why would we greenlight the production of a new aircraft when it has already and very intentionally been made obsolete? To which Comrade Georgy Babakin, Chief Radar Engineer OKB-301, had a ready answer. The Lavochkin Bureau's A team were working on SAMs. Their B team were working on air-to-air missiles. The C team were putting things together for the very early stages of the Soviet space program. Which left the D team and the reserves to come in clutch. And clutch they did. Because their solution was, let us test the Sukhoi radar. Let us do it. Let us take the risk of developing this system for the Yak. And we can get it into service ASAP. And this whole program led to this. Behold, the LA-200B, or as we have come to know and love it as, the snos. This thing has to be, in my opinion, the single dumbest looking jet aircraft of the early Cold War. Period. And that is a truly fierce competition. Developing this monstrosity wasn't easy. The Sukhoi radar, as we've established, was bloody massive. And due to being an air intercept radar, it had to be mounted forward. Putting it under the wing, like older World War II night fighters, wasn't practical due to its weight. So the only place to put it was the nose. Except that's where the intake for the engines were. So they had to redesign the entire front end and bolt the intakes onto the sides. This caused airflow volume issues, not to mention the added weight of the radar made performance decidedly worse. So naturally they fitted an afterburner to the rear engine to compensate. However, that of course ruins the entire point of the aircraft having loiter capability, as you have now doubled fuel consumption. And then, guess what guys, you'll never believe it, it got worse. This vicious cycle of trying to put the Sukhoi radar on the LA-200, increasing the weight, forced them to reinforce the landing gear, which added even more weight. That change meant the wheels could no longer fit into the originally designed wheel wells, and as such, they had to rework the fuselage. And this sort of thing kept spiraling down and down and down until eventually, by the time they got it all working, they'd lost over 1,000 feet of max ceiling height and 50 miles an hour of top speed, as well as a huge chunk of its fuel capacity. As a result, the LA-200B, the ugliest fighter of the era, was relegated to an avionics testbed, debugging all of the systems for its replacement. Yakovlev, at the last moment, had clutched victory from the jaws of defeat, as the Yak-25 passed its acceptance trials with flying colours. In fact, aside from the technical issues mentioned with the radar and avionics, not to mention the AM-5 still occasionally exploding, the Yak-25 had an absolutely stellar development cycle and a really good career, a rarity in Soviet aviation as we know. Multiple variants immediately followed. The Recon type, with its distinctive U-2-esque straight elongated wings, a low-altitude nuclear strike bomber prototype, the beginnings of a tactical fighter for CAS missions that would become the Yak-28, and at the same time, both Lavochkin and Biznovat had been making serious strides in missile technology, including the development of one of the very first beam-riding air-to-air missiles, the K-5, or the AA-1 in NATO terms. For the first time in a long time, the Soviets were on top. Their propaganda loudly proclaimed to all and sundry that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics would proclaim victory over the threat of the strategic bomber.
Oh man, who the hell are you lying to? The only thing longer than your line of bullshit there is the bread lines in your country. Are we playing the starving games? In about 50 years, that joke's gonna crush.
Buff, leave him alone. He just doesn't know any better.
You know, Uncle Sam, we could teach him real fast. It rhymes with dropping the sun on him. Okay, it doesn't rhyme with that. That's exactly what it is.
Buff, we can't just nuke all of Russia.
Well, it really changes things, because, yes, we can. It's kind of frowned upon. I feel like this problem's just we're kicking the can down the road. If we handle it now, there's not any foreshadowing here. If we handle it now, we don't gotta deal with it later.
The answer is no, and that's final.
Fine. You locked out this time, Slavic Special Ed, you snow Romanian.
Snow Romanian?
See, that's the thing. In the Americas, no one wants to be a Mexican, so you can call Canadians snow Mexicans, and they take a huge offense to it. But in Europe, no one wants to be Romanian, so just call them a snow Romanian. Ta-da!
Okay, stop right there. You're already trying to get HLC cancelled, you do not need to get me cancelled. This is my channel. We're gonna leave Grandpa Buff to do Grandpa things, although he's kind of talking about his youth. Is this like a retro-futuristic flashback? Though if you want to help me in case I do get demonetized, please like and subscribe if you've been enjoying the video so far. I mean, we're almost near the end, so I hope so by now. And join my Patreon to support me. You get early access, you get to hang out in the Discord, it's really great fun. And of course, if you want to one-time support me, use my promo code JDAM at your next checkout for Gamer Subs. Anyway, yes, the arrival of Grandpa Buff was a devastating blow. The B-47 was bad enough. With the B-52, they now have something capable of carrying 1,000 Hiroshimas worth of nuclear ordnance while going near supersonic speed at 50,000 feet. And being Boeing in the 1950s, they could build a lot of them. Worse still, rumors were circulating around among the various KGB sources in the US military-industrial complex that a low-altitude Mach 2 nuclear-capable bomber was in the design phase. So it was evident they needed something fast, in every sense of that word. And it was here, at this moment, that the comeback was on! That's right, lads. Old mate Semyon Lavochkin is not out of the game yet. We still got one last roll of the dice. That interceptor contract is still ours, fellas. I can feel it. Yakovlev can overpromise big dreams all he wants. Well, he should know that overpromising on defense contracts is a competitive sport here in the Soviet Union, and we're gonna fucking win! Comrades Tikhomirov and Lavochkin, having worked together on the LA-200 as well as the early phases of the Bureaucratic project, approached the Council of Ministers with a radical new concept, a revolutionary way of approaching the development of combat aviation and its associated weapon systems. The Weapon System Complex. For those familiar with the development of the Tomcat and its symbiotic relationship to the AIM-54 Phoenix, imagine that except a formalized program which encompasses the entire development process of every single component in a weapon system, essentially building everything from scratch to meet a singular design objective. Everything created in-house across the various OKBs, bespoke to one finished product. The project in question was designated K-15, and it was adopted on the 20th of November 1953 with, and I quote, great enthusiasm by both the Council of Ministers and the various bureaus assigned to its construction. And what they came up with is nothing short of ludicrous, especially for the 1950s. At a gross weight of 21 tons, a ceiling altitude of 53,000 feet, a top speed of 1,000 miles an hour, and able to achieve both of these insane metrics 3 minutes after takeoff, This thing cruises at the LA-200's top speed. Just look at the design. Delta wings, a long slender fuselage, and semi-active radar-guided missiles. One variant of which carries a nuclear fucking warhead. That's right. You thought only the capitalists were crazy with the genie. No. This is a guided, radar-controlled, nuclear air-to-air weapon. What's more, they plan to install the new fully autonomous GCI system in this bad boy, theoretically using the Lazur, or Prussian Blue, GCI network. This meant, theoretically, the PVO command and control network could remotely deploy a supersonic interceptor with nuclear missiles and then execute the entire engagement from their bunker. All the crew needed to do was follow the on-screen prompts and pull the trigger, like some kind of Windows-powered border patrol agent. And believe me, this thing would excel in border control. Now, with stats like these, and completely ludicrous capabilities for the 1950s, you would think that everyone would know about Project LA-50, or the Anaconda, as it came to be called. Well, there is a reason why everyone doesn't. This wasn't a case of, and then it got worse. Oh, no. This was one of the rare yet incredibly on-brand cases of socialists screwed from the start. You see, they had designed the entire aircraft around a brand new engine being designed by our main man, Vladimir Klimov. Except the entire development process of the afterburning turbojet, designated VK9, was a complete and utter train wreck. In fact, it was so bad I can't even find any sources on it other than the oblique references to it throughout the various documents and books on the LA-250. All with similar commentary along the lines of, hey, this engine existed, but it was cursed, didn't get out of the early prototype stage, and was nearly impossible. It was so bad, I couldn't even find a prototype drawing, or a schematic, or even a photo of it in the factory. Nothing. So after doing all of this design work for over half a year, the Lavochkin team had to rework the entire airframe to fit Ukrainian Gigachad Arkhip Lyulka's new engine, the AL-7F, which, like the VK9, hadn't even been built yet, though at least it was actually being built. The only problem was it had something like half the intended thrust of the VK9. They had to change the entire layout of the avionics, increase external fuel carriage capability, and adjust the mounting mechanism for the radar to fit an even bigger emitter, because Comrade Tikhomirov had come up with something even more powerful, a radar system capable of detecting targets at 25 miles and engaging them at 12. It could also guide the entire suite of Soviet radar missiles in the development pipeline, as well as the existing K-5 currently entering service. The forced redesign, as well as the delays in the AL-7F's testing phase, meant it took longer than ideal to get a prototype out of the hangar doors. But by June 16, 1956, the LA-250V1 was transported to the airfield for ground tests. Initial progress looked exceedingly promising. The avionics functioned according to the specifications, and the stability on the ground was well within tolerances. So, after an extensive series of high-speed taxiing runs, she was confirmed and certified for a test flight. Thus, on July 16th, exactly a month after the prototype began testing, the Lavochkin team rolled their new baby out of the hangar and prepped it for flight. And then, say it with me everyone, it got worse. The LA-250 rolled down the runway just fine, thundering into the sky with confidence. At which point, everything started to go haywire. The control inputs were extremely sluggish. However, when they increased stick deflection to compensate, the aircraft would violently oscillate, sending it into an extreme right bank. Gingerly bringing it back under control, the test pilots correctly decided to land immediately. But due to the emergency forcing an expedited landing of the aircraft, and the design's inherent high landing speed due to its role as an interceptor, they didn't really have any time to slow down. As a result, they touched down way too fast and bounced, collapsing the right gear in the impact. The LA-250 dropped back to the tarmac and started skidding along the runway's edge, the damaged gear dragging it further along. This built up heat, which when combined with the extreme shock damage, started a fire, sending sparks showering along behind the airframe. In an act of desperation, the pilot deployed the drag chute, but that immediately caught alight and tore off in the slipstream, barely having any effect. The aircraft was already doomed. The first LA-250 prototype ran off the end of the runway and slammed through the airfield perimeter fence, the gear completely collapsing in the process. The wreckage of the aircraft skidded across the emergency gravel runoff and came to a halt before starting to burn with intensity. And it was here that test pilot Comrade Kolchetkov proved his skill as an experimental aviator. Instinctively, without prompting, he pulled the fire extinguisher system, jettisoned the cockpit canopy, and helped his co-pilot evacuate, both men escaping the incident with nothing but bruises. The man had just landed a barely controllable prototype while on fire, saving his subordinate and himself in the process. His titanium testicles just go to show that it doesn't matter whether it's east or west, test pilots are, as the kids these days say, #built different. Dousing the now burning LA-250 in firefighting foam, the remains were shipped back to the VVS PVO Research Center for further analysis. And what they found was rather humiliating for Lavochkin. It turned out that in anticipation of the LA-250's larger size, the engineers had fitted hydraulic actuators double the size of the ones regularly installed on Soviet fighter aircraft. However, when the project was scaled down due to not having the VK9 engine available, they hadn't reduced them. Crucially though, they did install the regular fighter-sized hydraulic pressure and regulator system. So the actuators were overpowered, but the regulators were underpowered. As such, this caused a delay in the pilot moving the stick and the control surfaces moving. Except when they did move, it would fling the aircraft with a much higher level of inputted deflection, which the pilot would then instinctively overcorrect. And because of the size of the LA-250 as well as its control scheme, they were using a form of hydraulic force feedback system to simulate stick forces for the pilot. And as you can probably guess, if the hydraulic system is configured incorrectly, this wasn't working either. Meaning that the test pilots had absolutely no idea just what kind of effect their stick movements were having on the aircraft, and as such, they were having too much of an effect while knowing too little. The Lavochkin team had screwed up so spectacularly in such a complex way that they built the Soviet Union's very first analog computing full immersion flight simulator, complete with a full cockpit, fully simulated avionics, and all the aircraft systems, just to study the nuances of the flight control system's behavior, which eventually proved the engineers at the VVS correct. So, back to the workshop it was. The design team at Lavochkin reworked the hydraulics in a total overhaul of the system, while addressing the other suggested tweaks put forward by the test pilots, among which was our friend from episode 2, Mark Galai. And after 9 months of work, the LA-250A1 was rolled out of the hangar, ready for round 2. Except on the train ride over to the test airfield, several of the new reinforcing bolts installed in the landing gear assembly had a catastrophic failure and broke the entire prototype en route. So they, once again, wheeled it back to the factory, fixed the landing gear, and then finally got the go-ahead for another round of testing. The problem was, the venue for the flight testing had since been changed due to other programs taking up the original facility, meaning it had to be done at the Zhukovsky airfield, which was on the complete other side of Moscow. Now this normally wouldn't be an issue, as they just dismantle the prototype to move it, and then reassemble it on site. However, due to the extremely advanced aerodynamic shell they had designed for it, the tail unit was one giant all-moving flight surface, with the engines loaded into it in a pod configuration, similar to how they install engines into an F-15 today. This meant they couldn't detach the vertical stabilizer, or the tail section. And I don't know if you know much about socialist countries, but one of the very few perks they actually have is excellent public transit. And Moscow is covered end to end in public electric trams. So the Lavochkin Bureau had to design a pair of special forklift vehicles to travel with the LA-250 prototype, just to lift up the tram cables for the aircraft to pass under on its way through Moscow. They had to design an entire vehicle just to move it across town. God, I love the Soviet Union. As my dear friend History of Everything so often says, if it wasn't for all the corpses it left behind, it would be the funniest thing to ever exist. Though they probably needn't have bothered, because after only a few test flights, the second prototype ate shit as well, this time during a test of its avionics in low visibility conditions. Due to the absolutely awful visibility forward, caused by a cramped cockpit and the absurdly long nose housing the radar, not to mention the notoriously grim Russian weather, Comrade Kolchetkov couldn't identify the runway threshold and landed around 10 meters short of the asphalt, collapsing the landing gear and sending the LA-250 skidding along the runway once again, causing it to immediately catch fire. This time, he barely escaped with his life, as during the impact the canopy rail jammed. It's a miracle he managed to force his way out. The investigation into the crash concurred with the test pilot's statement. Visibility forward was far too poor. Thus, for the LA-250A Mark III, they added a distinct droop in the nose so the pilot could see over it, giving the aircraft an extremely goofy appearance. But by now, it was already too late. In the time it had taken to straighten out all of these issues, redesign the airframe multiple times, and then rebuild the prototypes, they had gone from a cutting-edge revolutionary concept aircraft in 1953 to a prototype with no working radar, underpowered engines with limited availability, and only 50 ready-to-fire missiles, with no foreseeable end to the program, despite it now being 1958. 5 years of development for nothing. And while all of this was going on, Tikhomirov had failed to deliver the K-15U radar system he promised. The GCI system was still in its debugging phase. The missiles and their guidance systems were still severely undercooked, and to top it all off, out of nowhere, the real comeback happened. Resurrected in the wake of Stalin's demise was Pavel motherfucking Sukhoi, who delivered a banger of an interceptor in the Sukhoi 9. An interceptor that was working, in service, and using Lyulka's AL-7Fs. Meaning the project had no engines available to continue anyway. And so, by the middle of 1959, with Lavochkin hard at work designing missiles, while his deputy coordinated with Sergei Koryolov's space program, the K-15 complex met its end. The LA-250 was relegated to being a testbed for the components that were already completed, in order to gather data for use in future interceptor programs. After all that calamity, its final indignity was to serve as the testing ground for its replacement. And in the process, it became the very last manned aircraft Lavochkin would ever build. Yet, that wasn't the only reason. The LA-250's cancellation wasn't just due to the delays. Oh no. As all of this had been going on, one of the other bureaus had been made aware of the interceptor program's troubles. Worse still, they'd been informed of not just the arrival of the B-58 Hustler, but something potentially even scarier. A high-altitude recon aircraft and a strategic bomber, both of which being capable of reaching ridiculous altitudes and utterly ludicrous speeds. Something needed to be built to meet this impending threat. The Soviets had the need. The need for speed. And if there was one man who could deliver, it was Artyom Mikoyan. And deliver, he most certainly did. But that's a story for another time.